Here's the truth nobody tells you. When a man and a woman both stop contacting each other, the silence becomes louder than the relationship ever was. Because once the messages stop, once the distractions disappear, both people are finally forced to face what they truly meant to each other. When a man and woman both stop contacting each other, something strange begins to happen. At first, it feels calm, almost peaceful. No more checking the phone every 5 minutes. No more waiting for a text. No more anxiety over who replied last. Both people try to convince themselves they're fine. They tell themselves, maybe this is for the best. Silence creates emotional clarity in a way constant communication never can. When two people are talking every day, emotions become mixed with habits, reactions, expectations, and routines. A message arrives, another reply follows, and both people stay emotionally occupied without ever truly understanding what they feel underneath it all. But when communication suddenly stops, something changes. The emotional noise disappears. And in that quiet space, people finally begin hearing their real thoughts. At first, silence feels uncomfortable. Both the man and the woman try to distract themselves from it. They scroll through social media, stay busy with friends, or throw themselves into work just to avoid thinking too deeply. But silence is patient, it waits. And eventually, when life becomes quiet at night, the emotions they were avoiding slowly rise to the surface. This is when clarity begins. Without constant texting or daily interaction, people stop reacting emotionally in the moment and start reflecting emotionally instead. They begin replaying conversations in their minds. They remember not only the arguments, but also the moments that made them feel safe, understood, and connected. And suddenly, they can see the relationship from a distance instead of from inside the chaos of it. Sometimes that clarity is painful. A person may realize they pushed someone away out of pride. They may recognize that their anger was really fear of vulnerability. Or they may finally understand how much emotional comfort the other person brought into their life. These realizations rarely happen during constant communication because the relationship moves too fast for deep reflection. Silence slows everything down. And in that stillness, emotions become impossible to fake. If the connection was shallow, silence exposes it quickly. The attachment fades because there was never anything meaningful holding it together. But if the connection was real, silence often makes the emotion stronger because absence removes distractions and reveals emotional truth. This is why people are often surprised by how much they miss someone after weeks of no contact. It's not always about loneliness, it's about clarity. The heart finally notices what the ego ignored when the person was still around every day. And the most interesting part is this: silence doesn't only reveal feelings about the other person. It also reveals truths about yourself, your fears, your emotional patterns, your mistakes, your needs. That's why periods of no contact can change people deeply. Because in silence, there is nowhere left to hide from what you truly feel. And once emotional clarity arrives, a person can never completely return to emotional confusion again. Distance reveals true attachment because when someone is no longer part of your daily life, you finally discover whether they were simply a habit or someone who genuinely mattered to your heart. While two people are constantly talking, seeing each other, or checking in every day, it's easy to confuse routine with real emotional connection. Messages become automatic, attention becomes expected, and sometimes people stop appreciating each other because the presence feels guaranteed. But distance changes everything. The moment communication stops, both people are forced to experience life without the other person's energy in it. At first, the ego often steps in to create false confidence. A man may tell himself, "I'm fine, I don't need this." A woman may convince herself she's already moving on. But true attachment doesn't reveal itself immediately. It reveals itself slowly, through moments that unexpectedly feel empty. It happens in ordinary situations. A song reminds them of a memory. Something funny happens, and their first instinct is to text that person before realizing they no longer can. They reach for their phone out of habit, only to remember the silence between them. And those small moments begin exposing emotions they thought they had under control. That's the power of distance. It strips away distractions and leaves behind emotional truth. If the connection was built only on attention, attraction, or convenience, distance weakens it quickly. The emotional pull fades because there was no deeper attachment underneath. But when two people truly mattered to each other, distance often intensifies the feelings instead of erasing them. Because real attachment is not based only on presence, it's based on emotional impact. People often think attachment is proven when someone stays close, but actually, attachment is proven when someone is gone and their absence still changes your emotional world, when their silence affects your mood, when memories continue appearing without invitation, when part of you keeps wondering whether they're thinking about you too. And this is where many people become confused. They assume missing someone automatically means the relationship was right. But missing someone only proves the connection had emotional weight. It doesn't always mean the relationship was healthy. Sometimes distance reveals love. Other times it reveals dependency, fear of loneliness, or unfinished emotional needs. That's why distance can become such a powerful teacher. It forces people to stop looking at the relationship through daily emotions and start seeing it through emotional truth. Some people realize they lost someone deeply valuable. Others realize they were attached more to the attention than the actual person. But either way, distance reveals what constant closeness often hides. Who truly mattered once they were no longer there. Ego and fear start battling internally the moment two people stop contacting each other, even if neither of them admits it openly. On the outside, both may appear calm, confident, and completely unbothered. They post normally, continue their routines, and try to look like life is moving forward without difficulty. But internally, a silent emotional war begins. Because when communication disappears, the ego wants protection while the heart wants answers. The ego immediately steps in to defend pride. It says things like, "Don't text first. If they cared, they would reach out. You can't look weak now." The ego is terrified of rejection because rejection feels like losing control. So instead of encouraging honesty, it encourages emotional distance. It convinces people that silence equals power, but fear enters at the same time. Fear whispers different questions. What if they're forgetting me? What if this silence becomes permanent? What if I lost someone important because I was too stubborn to speak? And now the person feels trapped between two powerful emotions. The ego wants to maintain dignity, while fear wants reassurance. This battle becomes exhausting because both sides pull in opposite directions. One moment a person feels strong and determined never to reach out again. The next moment they are rereading old messages, checking social media, or imagining conversations that will probably never happen. Their emotions become unpredictable because they are no longer reacting to the other person directly. They are reacting to their own thoughts, and thoughts become louder in silence. What makes this situation even harder is that both people are often experiencing the same internal struggle at the exact same time. Each person waits for the other to break the silence first. Each person secretly wants confirmation that the connection mattered. But pride creates emotional paralysis. Nobody wants to risk being the one who appears more affected. This is why silence after emotional connection can feel so intense. It's not just about missing someone. It's about the psychological tension between vulnerability and self-protection. Some people eventually allow fear to win. They reach out because the emotional uncertainty becomes heavier than their pride. Others allow ego to stay in control for too long, and by the time they finally want to reconnect, the emotional distance has grown too large. But the important thing to understand is this: ego often disguises itself as strength. Real strength is emotional honesty. Real strength is being mature enough to communicate instead of playing emotional games with silence. Because many relationships don't end from lack of feelings. They end because two people let pride speak louder than vulnerability. And while the ego protects people from temporary embarrassment, it can also cost them meaningful connection if they listen to it for too long. One person usually breaks first emotionally, even if both people promised themselves they would stay strong. Silence may begin as a mutual decision, but emotional endurance between two people is rarely equal. One person eventually starts feeling the weight of the distance more intensely. And the interesting part is that it's not always the person people expect. Sometimes the one who looked emotionally detached during the relationship becomes the person struggling most afterward. Why? Because emotions delayed are not emotions erased. During the relationship, distractions, pride, or emotional walls may have hidden what they truly felt. But once the connection disappears completely, those walls begin collapsing quietly from the inside. At first, the person tries to maintain control. They tell themselves not to think about it. They convince themselves reaching out would only make things worse. But emotions don't disappear simply because someone decides to ignore them. In fact, Silence often amplifies feelings because there is no outlet left for them. This is when emotional cracks begin to show. The person starts replaying memories constantly. Ordinary moments suddenly carry emotional weight. Places feel different. Songs feel personal. Nights become harder because there's nothing distracting them from their thoughts anymore. And while they may still appear perfectly fine to everyone else, internally they are fighting emotional conversations in their head every single day. Eventually, curiosity and emotion begin overpowering pride. They wonder if the other person misses them too. They check their phone hoping for a message they pretend not to care about. Sometimes they type long paragraphs and delete them before sending. Other times they try indirect ways to feel connected again, viewing stories quickly, posting things they hope the other person notices, or asking mutual friends subtle questions. This is the emotional breaking point people rarely talk about. It's not dramatic on the outside. It happens quietly, internally. A person slowly realizes that the silence they thought would bring peace has actually forced them to confront emotions they never fully understood before. But emotionally breaking first does not always mean weakness. Sometimes it means that person is simply more emotionally honest. They are no longer able to pretend the connection meant nothing. And in many cases, the person who breaks emotionally first becomes the one who grows the most afterward because they finally stop hiding from their feelings. What's tragic is that both people are often hurting at the same time while assuming the other person has completely moved on. Misunderstanding grows in silence because nobody truly knows what the other person is experiencing behind closed doors. And this is why emotional distance becomes so dangerous. The longer silence continues, the more stories people create in their minds. Eventually, those stories begin replacing reality itself, until one person finally reaches a point where pretending not to care becomes harder than admitting they do. Absence exposes the real connection, because when two people are no longer part of each other's daily lives, all the surface level distractions disappear. There are no more constant notifications, no more quick conversations to fill emotional gaps, and no more temporary reassurance. What remains is only the emotional impact they truly had on one another. And that's when people finally discover whether the connection was deep or simply convenient. While someone is present every day, it's easy to take them for granted. Human beings naturally adapt to consistency. A text becomes expected. Attention becomes normal. Even emotional support can slowly become something people stop consciously appreciating because they assume it will always be there. But the moment that presence disappears, reality changes very quickly. Suddenly the silence becomes noticeable. A person realizes certain moments no longer feel the same. They notice the absence in small ways first. There's nobody to send random thoughts to. Nobody who understands specific jokes or memories. Nobody who naturally became part of their emotional routine. And what surprises many people is that they don't only miss the conversations, they miss the feeling the other person created in their life. That feeling is what reveals the real connection. Because attraction alone fades quickly in absence. Attention alone fades too, but emotional connection behaves differently. Emotional connection leaves traces behind. It changes the emotional atmosphere of someone's daily life. And when that atmosphere disappears, the emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. This is why some people try desperately to replace distractions after a breakup or no contact situation. They stay constantly busy, jump into new conversations, or surround themselves with noise because silence keeps reminding them of what's missing. But no distraction completely removes emotional truth. In quiet moments, the mind always returns to the person who mattered deeply. At the same time, absence can also expose uncomfortable truths about the relationship itself. Sometimes people realize they were attached more to validation than genuine compatibility. They may discover they missed the attention, not the actual connection. And while that realization hurts, it also creates emotional maturity because it forces honesty. But when the connection was truly meaningful, absence often deepens appreciation. People begin seeing things they overlooked before. They remember emotional safety, understanding, support, and the small moments that once felt ordinary but now feel irreplaceable. And this is the irony of human nature. Many people fully recognize value only after distance removes easy access to it. That doesn't mean every separated couple should reunite. Some connections are meant only to teach lessons. But absence has a way of removing illusion. It strips relationships down to emotional truth. Because when someone is gone and their absence still changes your heart, your thoughts, and your emotional world, that's when you discover what the connection truly meant. What happens next depends on growth, not longing. And this is the part most people misunderstand after two people stop contacting each other. Many assume that missing someone deeply is enough to rebuild a relationship. They believe strong emotions automatically lead people back together. But emotions alone are rarely the deciding factor, because two people can miss each other every single day and still fail if neither of them has grown beyond the problems that created the distance in the first place. Longing is emotional. Growth is transformational. Longing makes people remember the connection. Growth changes the way they handle the connection if it ever returns. When silence creates emotional clarity, both people eventually face a choice. They can either stay emotionally stuck in memories, or they can begin understanding themselves more honestly. Some people use the silence only to romanticize the past. They replay good moments repeatedly while ignoring the unhealthy patterns that damaged the relationship. They confuse emotional pain with proof that the relationship should continue. But growth requires something deeper than emotion. It requires self-awareness. A person starts asking difficult questions. How did I contribute to the distance? What fears controlled my behavior? Did I communicate honestly, or did I expect the other person to read my mind? These questions are uncomfortable because they force accountability instead of blame. And this is where people begin changing. Sometimes the silence teaches a man how emotionally unavailable he had become. Sometimes it teaches a woman that constantly seeking reassurance pushed the relationship into anxiety. Sometimes both realized they loved each other but lacked the emotional maturity to maintain healthy communication. Growth turns pain into understanding. Without growth, reconnecting usually creates the same outcome again. The attraction returns, the emotions return, but eventually the same habits, insecurities, and communication problems return too. And that's why many couples break apart repeatedly. They reconnect emotionally without evolving personally. But when real growth happens, something different changes inside a person. Their reactions become calmer. Their communication becomes more honest. Their ego becomes less controlling. They stop focusing only on being loved and start learning how to love in a healthier way. That's when reconnection becomes meaningful instead of temporary. And sometimes growth leads to a different realization entirely. Sometimes people understand that missing someone does not always mean they belong together. They can appreciate the connection while also accepting that the relationship no longer aligns with who they are becoming. That level of emotional maturity is rare because most people chase comfort, not growth. They want the familiar feeling back without changing the behaviors that destroyed it. But relationships survive not because two people miss each other enough. They survive because two people become emotionally wiser enough to love differently than before. And in the end, that's what truly decides what happens next. Not longing, but growth. So if you're in a season of silence with someone right now, don't rush to fight the emptiness. Sometimes distance is not there to punish you, it's there to reveal you. Reveal your feelings. Reveal your patterns. Reveal whether the connection was real or simply comfortable. And whatever happens next, remember this: the strongest relationship